Lying Awake. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Jason Mills. Charles Dickens' 200th Anniversary Collection, Volume 2. Lying Awake by Charles Dickens. My uncle lay with his eyes half closed, and his nightcap drawn almost down to his nose. His fancy was already wandering, and began to mingle up the present scene with the crater of Vesuvius, the French Opera, the Colosseum at Rome, Dolly's Chop House in London, and all the farrago of noted places with which the brain of a traveller is crammed. In a word, he was just falling asleep. Thus that delightful writer, Washington Irving, in his Tales of a Traveller. But it happened to me the other night to be lying, not with my eyes half closed, but with my eyes wide open, not with my nightcap drawn almost down to my nose, for on sanitary principles I never wear a nightcap, but with my hair pitchforked and tousled all over the pillow, not just falling asleep by any means, but glaringly, persistently, and obstinately broad awake. Perhaps, with no scientific intention or invention, I was illustrating the theory of the duality of the brain. Perhaps one part of my brain, being wakeful, sat up to watch the other part, which was sleepy. Be that as it may, something in me was as desirous to go to sleep as it possibly could be, but something else in me would not go to sleep, and was as obstinate as George the Third. Thinking of George the Third, for I devote this paper to my train of thoughts as I lay awake, most people lying awake sometimes, and having some interest in the subject, put me in mind of Benjamin Franklin, and so Benjamin Franklin's paper on the art of procuring pleasant dreams, which would seem necessarily to include the art of going to sleep, came into my head. Now, as I often used to read that paper when I was a very small boy, and as I recollect everything I read then as perfectly as I forget everything I read now, I quoted, "Get out of bed, beat up and turn your pillow, shake the bedclothes well with at least 20 shakes, then throw the bed open and leave it to cool. In the meanwhile, continuing undressed, walk about your chamber. When you begin to feel the cold air unpleasant, then return to your bed, and you will soon fall asleep, and your sleep will be sweet and pleasant." Not a bit of it. I performed the whole ceremony, and if it were possible for me to be more saucer-eyed than I was before, that was the only result that came of it. Except Niagara. The two quotations from Washington Irving and Benjamin Franklin may have put it in my head by an American association of ideas, but there I was, and the horseshoe fall was thundering and tumbling in my eyes and ears, and the very rainbows that I left upon the spray when I really did last look upon it were beautiful to see. The night light being quite as plain, however, and sleep seeming to be many thousand miles further off than Niagara, I made up my mind to think a little about sleep, which I no sooner did than I whirled off in spite of myself to Drury Lane Theatre, and there saw a great actor and dear friend of mine, whom I had been thinking of in the day, playing Macbeth, and heard him apostrophising the death of each day's life, as I have heard him many a time in the days that are gone. But sleep. I will think about sleep. I am determined to think, this is the way I went on, about sleep. I must hold the word sleep tight and fast, or I shall be off at a tangent in half a second. I feel myself unaccountably straying already into Clare Market. Sleep! It would be curious, as illustrating the equality of sleep, to inquire how many of its phenomena are common to all classes, to all degrees of wealth and poverty, to every grade of education and ignorance. Here, for example, is Her Majesty Queen Victoria in her palace, this present blessed night, and here is Winking Charlie, a sturdy vagrant, in one of Her Majesty's jails. Her Majesty has fallen many thousands of times from that same tower which I claim a right to tumble off now and then. So has Winking Charlie. Her Majesty in her sleep has opened or prorogued Parliament, or has held a drawing-room, attired in some very scanty dress, the deficiencies and improprieties of which have caused her great uneasiness. I, in my degree, have suffered unspeakable agitation of mind from taking the chair at a public dinner at the London Tavern in my night-clothes, which not all the courtesy of my kind friend and host Mr. Bathe could persuade me were quite adapted to the occasion. Winking Charlie has been repeatedly tried in a worse condition. Her Majesty is no stranger to a vault or firmament, of a sort of floor-cloth, with an indistinct pattern distantly resembling eyes, which occasionally obtrudes itself on her repose. Neither am I. Neither is Winking Charley. It is quite common to all three of us to skim along with airy strides a little above the ground, also to hold, with the deepest interest, dialogues with various people, all represented by ourselves, and to be at our wits' end to know what they are going to tell us, and to be indescribably astonished by the secrets they disclose. It is probable that we have all three committed murders and hidden bodies. It is pretty certain that we have all desperately wanted to cry out and have had no voice, that we have all gone to the play and not been able to get in, that we have all dreamed much more of our youth than of our later lives, that... I have lost it. The thread's broken. And up I go. I, lying here with the nightlight before me, up I go, for no reason on earth that I can find out, and drawn by no links that are visible to me, up the great St. Bernard. I have lived in Switzerland, and rambled among the mountains, but why I should go there now, and why up the great St. Bernard in preference to any other mountain, I have no idea. As I lie here, broad awake, and with every sense so sharpened that I can distinctly hear distant noises inaudible to me at another time, I make that journey, as I really did, on the same summer day, with the same happy party. Ah, 2 since dead, I grieve to think. And there is the same track, with the same black wooden arms to point the way, and there are the same storm refuges here and there, and there is the same snow falling at the top, and there are the same frosty mists, and there is the same intensely cold convent with its menagerie smell, and the same breed of dogs fast dying out, and the same breed of jolly young monks, whom I mourn to know as humbugs, and the same convent parlour with its piano, and the sitting round the fire, and the same supper, and the same lone night in a cell, and the same bright fresh morning, when going out into the highly rarefied air was like a plunge into an icy bath. Now, see here what comes along, and why does this thing stoke into my mind on the top of a Swiss mountain? It is a figure that I once saw, just after dark, chalked upon a door in a little back lane near a country church, my first church. How young a child I may have been at the time I don't know, but it horrified me so intensely, in connection with the churchyard, I suppose, for it smokes a pipe, and has a big hat with each of its ears sticking out in a horizontal line under the brim, and is not in itself more oppressive than a mouth from ear to ear, a pair of goggle eyes, and hands like 2 bunches of carrots, 5 in each, can make it, that it is still vaguely alarming to me to recall, as I have often done before, lying awake, the running home, the looking behind, the horror of its following me. Though whether disconnected from the door, or door and all, I can't say, and perhaps never could. It lays a disagreeable train. I must resolve to think of something on the voluntary principle. The balloon ascents of this last season. They will do to think about while I lie awake, as well as anything else. I must hold them tight, though, for I feel them sliding away, and in their stead are the Mannings, husband and wife, hanging on the top of Horsemonger Lane Jail, in connection with which dismal spectacle I recall this curious fantasy of the mind, that, having beheld that execution, and having left those 2 forms dangling on the top of the entrance gateway, the man's a limp loose suit of clothes, as if the man had gone out of them, the woman's a fine shape, so elaborately corseted and artfully dressed that it was quite unchanged in its trim appearance as it slowly swung from side to side. I never could, by my uttermost efforts, for some weeks, present the outside of that prison to myself, which the terrible impression I had received continually obliged me to do, without presenting it with the 2 figures still hanging in the morning air, until, strolling past the gloomy place one night, when the street was deserted and quiet, and actually seeing that the bodies were not there, my fancy was persuaded, as it were, to take them down, and bury them within the precincts of the jail, where they have lain ever since. The balloon ascents of last season. Let me reckon them up. There were the horse, the bull, the parachute, and the tumbler hanging on, chiefly by his toes, I believe, below the car. Very wrong, indeed, and decidedly to be stopped. But, in connection with these and similar dangerous exhibitions, it strikes me that that portion of the public whom they entertain is unjustly reproached. Their pleasure is in the difficulty overcome. They are a public of great faith, and are quite confident that the gentleman will not fall off the horse, or the lady off the bull, or out of the parachute, and that the tumbler has a firm hold with his toes. They do not go to see the adventurer vanquished, but triumphant. There is no parallel in public combats between men and beasts, because nobody can answer for the particular beast, unless it were always the same beast, in which case it would be a mere stage show, which the same public would go in the same state of mind to see, entirely believing in the brute being beforehand safely subdued by the man. That they are not accustomed to calculate hazards and dangers with any nicety, we may know from their rash exposure of themselves in overcrowded steamboats, and unsafe conveyances, and places of all kinds. And I cannot help thinking that instead of railing and attributing savage motives to a people naturally well disposed and humane, it is better to teach them, and lead them argumentatively and reasonably, for they are very reasonable, if you will discuss a matter with them, to more considerate and wise conclusions. This is a disagreeable intrusion. Here is a man with his throat cut, dashing towards me as I lie awake. A recollection of an old story of a kinsman of mine, who, going home one foggy night to Hampstead, when London was much smaller and the road lonesome, suddenly encountered such a figure rushing past him, and presently 2 keepers from a madhouse in pursuit. A very unpleasant creature indeed to come into my mind unbidden, as I lie awake. The balloon ascents of last season. I must return to the balloons. Why did the bleeding man start out of them? Never mind. If I inquire, he will be back again. The balloons. This particular public have inherently a great pleasure in the contemplation of physical difficulties overcome, mainly, as I take it, because the lives of a large majority of them are exceedingly monotonous and real, and further, are a struggle against continual difficulties, and further still, because anything in the form of accidental injury, or any kind of illness or disability, is so very serious in their own sphere. I will explain this seeming paradox of mine. Take the case of a Christmas pantomime. Surely nobody supposes that the young mother in the pit, who falls into fits of laughter when the baby is boiled or sat upon, would be at all diverted by such an occurrence off the stage. Nor is the decent workman in the gallery, who is transported beyond the ignorant present by the delight with which he sees a stout gentleman pushed out of a 2 pair of stairs window, to be slandered by the suspicion that he will be in the least entertained by such a spectacle in any street in London, Paris, or New York. It always appears to me that the secret of this enjoyment lies in the temporary superiority to the common hazards and mischances of life, in seeing casualties, attended when they really occur with bodily and mental suffering, tears, and poverty, happen through a very rough sort of poetry, without the least harm being done to anyone, the pretence of distress in a pantomime being so broadly humorous as to be no pretence at all. Much as in the comic fiction I can understand the mother with a very vulnerable baby at home, greatly relishing the invulnerable baby on the stage, so in the Cremorne reality I can understand the mason, who is always liable to fall off a scaffold in his working jacket and to be carried to the hospital, having an infinite admiration of the radiant personage in spangles who goes into the clouds upon a bull, or upside down, and who, he takes it for granted, not reflecting upon the thing, has, by uncommon skill and dexterity, conquered such mischances as those to which he and his acquaintance are continually exposed. I wish the morgue in Paris would not come here as I lie awake, with its ghastly beds, and the swollen saturated clothes hanging up, and the water dripping, dripping all day long, upon that other swollen saturated something in the corner, like a heap of crushed over-ripe figs that I have seen in Italy. And this detestable morgue comes back again at the head of a procession of forgotten ghost stories. This will never do. I must think of something else as I lie awake, or, like that sagacious animal in the United States, who recognized the colonel who was such a dead shot, I am a gone coon. What shall I think of? The late brutal assaults. Very good subject. The late brutal assaults. Though whether, supposing I should see, here before me as I lie awake, the awful phantom described in one of those ghost stories, who, with a head-dress of shroud, was always seen looking in through a certain glass door at a certain dead hour, whether in such a case it would be the least consolation to me to know on philosophical grounds that it was merely my imagination, is a question I can't help asking myself by the way. The late brutal assaults. I strongly question the expediency of advocating the revival of whipping for those crimes. It is a natural and generous impulse to be indignant at the perpetration of inconceivable brutality, but I doubt the whipping panacea gravely. Not in the least regard or pity for the criminal, whom I hold in far lower estimation than a mad wolf, but in consideration for the general tone and feeling, which is very much improved since the whipping times. It is bad for a people to be familiarized with such punishments. When the whip went out of Bridewell, and ceased to be flourished at the cart's tail and at the whipping post, it began to fade out of madhouses, and workhouses, and schools and families, and to give place to a better system everywhere than cruel driving. It would be hasty, because a few brutes may be inadequately punished, to revive in any aspect what, in so many aspects, society is hardly yet happily rid of. The whip is a very contagious kind of thing, and difficult to confine within one set of bounds. Utterly abolish punishment by fine, a barbarous device, quite as much out of date as wager by battle, but particularly connected in the vulgar mind with this class of offence. At least quadruple the term of imprisonment for aggravated assaults, and above all let us, in such cases, have no pet prisoning, vain glorifying, strong soup and roasted meats, but hard work, and one unchanging and uncompromising dietary of bread and water, well or ill, and we shall do much better than by going down into the dark to grope for the whip among the rusty fragments of the rack and the branding iron, and the chains and gibbet from the public roads, and the weights that pressed men to death in the cells of Newgate. I had proceeded thus far, when I found I had been lying awake so long that the very dead began to wake too, and to crowd into my thoughts most sorrowfully. Therefore I resolved to lie awake no more, but to get up and go out for a night walk, which resolution was an acceptable relief to me, as I dare say it may prove now to a great many more. End of Lying Awake. Recording by Jason Mills.